chosen one, listen carefully. They paid a journalist to write a scandal about you. It printed. Your name sat at the top of a story that never happened, next to quotes nobody ever said. And for exactly 11 days, it looked like they'd won. Then a letter landed on that editor's desk, and everything they built came apart in public, with their names attached to it instead of yours. Let that sit for 1 second, because it matters. This wasn't a rumor that faded. This wasn't gossip that got old and got replaced by the next thing. This was a published piece, a byline, a headline, a story built specifically to make you look like the villain in a life you didn't choose to have people watching. Someone sat in a room and decided your name was worth spending money to destroy. They found a writer willing to take that money. They found an editor willing to run it without checking. And they thought that was the end of it. Publish, watch it spread, walk away clean. They didn't count on one thing: you know how to wait. While the story was circulating, while people you thought knew you were sharing it without asking you a single question, while your name was being said in group chats and comment sections by people who'd never spoken to you directly, you didn't post a reaction video. You didn't write a long statement. You didn't beg anyone to believe you. You did something slower and far more dangerous to the people who wrote it. You called a lawyer and you started building a file. Here's the thing about a fabricated story. It has to be perfect to survive. One quote that can't be sourced. One timeline that doesn't line up. One anonymous insider who doesn't actually exist. A rumor can survive being messy. A published article cannot. And the people who paid for this one didn't build it to survive a lawyer. They built it to survive a scroll. 11 days later, that same outlet published a correction. Not a quiet edit. Not a deleted tweet. A public retraction, with language their own legal team had to approve, admitting the story was false, admitting the sourcing didn't hold up, admitting they should never have run it. And somewhere in a group chat that used to have your name in it as a punchline, the energy went completely silent. Before we get into exactly how this played out, step by step, hit like and subscribe. Not for luck, not as a ritual, just because it tells me you're paying attention, and it puts this in front of the next person who needs to hear that a fake story doesn't always win just because it publishes first. Now let's go back to the beginning, because the part that's going to make you sit up straight isn't the retraction. It's how obvious the whole plan was, once you finally saw it laid out in black and white. Number 1, they went after your reputation because they couldn't touch anything else. Think about what it actually takes for someone to decide a fake news story is their best move. It means every direct approach already failed. They couldn't out-argue you. They couldn't outwork you. They couldn't get you fired, get you cut off, get you isolated the normal way, the slow way, the way most people try first. So they skipped straight to the most expensive option they had. They found someone with a byline and a deadline to fill, and they offered them a story that was flattering to write and easy to believe, because it fit exactly what people already wanted to think about you. That's worth saying twice. They didn't need people to believe something wild. They needed people to believe something convenient. A story doesn't need to be true to spread. It just needs to confirm what people were already halfway hoping was true. And the people around you, some of them, were halfway there already. That's the part that stings the most, isn't it? Not the strangers who shared it. The people who knew you and still didn't pause. But here's what they miscalculated. They assumed that because you don't argue in public, you don't keep records. They assumed silence meant you weren't paying attention. Every person who's ever tried to write you out of your own story makes this same mistake. They confuse quiet with unprepared. You've never been unprepared. You've just never seen the point in performing your defense before you had one worth performing. They needed you to react loudly and immediately, so the story could feed off your reaction, instead of its own facts. You didn't give them that. You gave them 11 days of nothing, while behind the scenes, you were doing the one thing they never planned for. You were reading their story line by line, looking for exactly where it would break. And it was going to break. Fabricated stories always have a seam. The only question was ever who would find it first. Them, scrambling to reinforce it, or you, calmly pulling the thread. There's a reason people default to attacking a reputation instead of anything else when they run out of real moves. Reputation feels cheap to attack and expensive to defend, and they were counting on that math working in their favor. A lawsuit takes money and time most people don't think they have. A public correction takes proof most people don't think they can get. They were betting on you feeling powerless in exactly the way most people feel powerless when a headline goes up with their name on it. What they didn't account for is that you don't operate on the timeline panic usually forces people into. You operate on the timeline the proof actually needs. Ask yourself why this specific method, out of everything available to them, not a confrontation, not a direct accusation they'd have to stand behind with their own name attached. A third party, a byline that wasn't theirs, an outlet they could point to later and say, "We just reported what we found," as if commissioning a story and reporting one are the same thing. That distance was the whole strategy. It let them cause damage while keeping their own hands looking clean, at least until the letter forced everyone's hands into the light at the same time. Number 2. The meeting where they picked the writer nobody would suspect. Somewhere before any of this reached you, there was a conversation. Maybe over drinks, maybe over a phone call, maybe in a group chat you'll never see the screenshots of. Someone said your name, followed by a version of, "We need to deal with this," and somebody else said they knew a writer who'd take the job, not a stranger with a grudge. Someone connected enough to be believable, hungry enough to skip the questions a careful journalist should have asked, and cheap enough to be worth the money. This is how these things actually happen. Nobody hires a professional to write the truth and slant it a little. They hire someone willing to build a story around a conclusion that was already decided before a single source was contacted. The reporting wasn't reporting. It was assembly. Find a few people willing to say vague, damaging things off the record. Frame your silence as guilt. Frame anyone who defends you as biased. Wrap it in enough journalistic language that it reads as credible to anyone skimming a headline on their phone for 4 seconds before sharing it. And they were counting on exactly that, the 4-second reader. The person who sees the headline feels a little validated in whatever they already suspected about you and hits share without opening the article past the second paragraph. That's not journalism working correctly. That's journalism being used as a delivery system for something that was decided in a private conversation weeks earlier. Here's what should unsettle them, and eventually will. Every step of that process leaves a trail. Every off-the-record source has to be recorded somewhere, even loosely. Every editorial decision to run a story without full verification has to be justified internally if it's ever challenged. They thought they were building a weapon. What they were actually building, without realizing it, was a paper trail with their fingerprints all over the handle. They didn't think about that part because they didn't think it would ever come to that. They thought you'd read the headline, feel humiliated, maybe post something defensive that made you look worse, and disappear from the conversation for a few months while they moved on to whatever came next. That's the playbook. It usually works because most people don't know what to do with a published lie except panic. You didn't panic. You picked up the phone and called someone whose entire job is knowing exactly what a published lie is worth in a courtroom. Think about how much planning actually goes into something like this. How much it undercuts the idea that this was ever spontaneous. Nobody stumbles into commissioning a fake story. It requires a decision, a budget, a follow-up call, an agreement about angle and timing. Somebody had to choose the publication date, probably around something else happening in your life, to maximize how much damage it could do while you were already stretched thin. That's not an outburst, that's a plan, with a calendar attached to it. And plans with calendars attached to them leave the kind of evidence that outbursts never do. There's also a specific kind of confidence required to greenlight something like this, and it's worth naming because it's the same confidence that made the whole plan sloppy. They assumed nobody would check. They assumed the speed of the internet would do their work for them before anyone slowed down enough to ask a hard question. That assumption is almost always where these plans fail, because it treats every target the same way, as someone who'll panic instead of someone who might, instead, calmly start asking for receipts. Number 3. The story goes live, and your phone doesn't stop. There's a specific kind of silence that happens the morning something like this drops. Not silence from the world, the opposite actually. Notifications stacking up faster than you can read them. People tagging you, some out of concern, some clearly enjoying it a little too much. The specific silence is inside you. That moment where you read your own name attached to a version of your life that isn't real, and for a second, the whole room goes quiet in your head while you process what you're looking at. You've felt that before, in smaller versions. This was the largest one yet. Here's what almost nobody understands about that moment, unless they've lived it. The instinct to explain yourself immediately is the trap. It's built into the format. A fabricated story wants your panic. It wants your rushed statement, your emotional thread, your desperate correction, posted at 2 in the morning with typos in it, because that reaction becomes its own headline. Accused responds, gets more clicks than the original story. You become the follow-up piece to your own smear. You didn't give it that. You read it once, closed the tab, and made one call. Not to a publicist, not to a friend with a big platform, to a lawyer. That decision alone tells you everything about the difference between how you move and how they expected you to move. Meanwhile, the story was doing exactly what it was designed to do. People who'd never spoken to you were suddenly experts on your character. Old acquaintances resurfaced with vague, unfalsifiable comments that added nothing but fed the fire anyway. Screenshots of the headline circulated stripped of context, stripped of the fact that it was one unverified article and not a confirmed fact. Somewhere in there, someone probably said the sentence you'll hear a version of for the rest of this video. There's no smoke without fire. There's plenty of smoke without fire. There's smoke whenever someone's willing to pay for a lighter. You knew that. You also knew that knowing it wasn't enough. Knowing you're innocent doesn't undo a headline. Feeling wronged doesn't force a correction. Only proof does that. So while the noise was at its loudest, you weren't drafting a response. You were requesting the article's edit history, saving every version of it you could find, and starting a folder that would eventually become the reason this entire thing collapsed. Somewhere in that first 24 hours, you had to make a decision most people never get tested on, whether to let the panic set the pace, or whether to set your own. Panic wants speed. Panic wants a statement before lunch. But a statement before lunch is a statement made with maybe 10% of the facts you'd have within a week, and every word of it would be quoted back at you later, regardless of what came after. You chose to move at the speed the proof needed, instead of the speed the outrage was demanding. And that single choice is the reason this ended the way it did, instead of dragging out for months. Number 4. The people who believed it before they finished reading it. This is the part that's harder to talk about than the article itself, because the article was written by strangers with a financial incentive to lie. The people who believed it instantly, some of them weren't strangers. Some of them had eaten dinner at your table, and they saw a headline, felt a flicker of, "I always kind of wondered," and decided that flicker was enough evidence to quietly step back. You noticed, of course you noticed, the texts that stopped, the invitations that got smaller, the way certain names went unusually quiet on a day when a normal friend would have reached out first, before assuming anything, just to ask if you were okay. Instead, some of them assumed the story was accurate before they'd verified a single line of it, because it was easier than sitting with the discomfort of defending someone publicly when the crowd had already picked a side. This is worth naming clearly, without turning it into something bigger than it is. People believing a lie about you for 11 days doesn't mean they were evil. It means they were convenient. It means loyalty, for some people, only exists when it's free. The second it might cost them something, a comment, an argument, a moment of social risk, it evaporates. That's not a character flaw unique to your situation. It's just something you find out about people at the worst possible time, which is exactly when a fabricated story is designed to reveal it. And here's the part that should reframe the whole 11 days for you, once you look back on it later. Every person who stepped back during that window told you something true about where they actually stood. Information you didn't have before and couldn't have gotten any other way. A fake scandal is a terrible thing to go through, and, without meaning to, an incredibly efficient filter. It doesn't create the divide, it just makes the divide visible faster than years of normal life would have. You weren't losing people during those 11 days. You were finding out who you'd already lost, quietly, a long time before the article ever ran. The story didn't cost you anything real, it just sent you the invoice early. It's worth being honest about how that feels in the moment too, instead of skipping straight to the tidy lesson. It hurts. Watching someone reduce years of knowing you to a headline they read for 8 seconds is not a small thing, and pretending it doesn't sting would be dishonest. The point isn't that it should feel fine. The point is that the sting is information, not injury. It tells you where the real flaw is, under all the people who were only ever standing on the surface. And there's a specific kind of person worth naming here. The one who didn't just believe it quietly, but repeated it, added their own commentary, sent it to someone else with a caption implying they'd suspected something for a while. That person wasn't a passive bystander caught in a wave of misinformation. That person was an active participant in spreading something false about you, and no retraction erases the fact that they chose to be one, in the moment when choosing mattered most. Number 5, the ones who said nothing and called it neutrality. Worse than the people who believed it outright were the ones who didn't say anything at all. Not a message of support, not a "hope you're doing okay," not even a private check-in. Just silence, dressed up afterward as staying out of it, as though watching someone get publicly smeared and choosing not to reach out is a neutral position instead of a choice with a direction. It isn't neutral, you know that. Staying quiet while a story circulates that you know is false, or at minimum, know is unverified, isn't taking no side. It's taking the safe side, which in that moment happened to be the side against you, because standing next to you publicly might have cost something socially. That's not caution. That's a decision people make, and then spend a long time pretending wasn't one. Some of them will tell you later, once the retraction runs and it's safe again, that they never believed it, that they were just staying out of the drama. Hold that thought for later in this video, because it's going to come back around, and it's going to matter exactly how convenient their timing turns out to be. For now, notice this. The people who reached out during the worst 11 days, before anyone knew how it would end, before there was any guarantee it would end in your favor at all, those people told you something real. They bet on you before there was proof it was safe to. That's the entire difference between support and performance. And it's a difference you now know with certainty for every person in your life going forward. You didn't need a crowd during those 11 days. You needed to know exactly who was actually standing next to you when standing next to you carried a cost. Now you know. And that knowledge doesn't disappear once the retraction prints. It stays. Neutrality has a very specific shape when you actually look at it closely. It always seems to appear the moment courage would cost something, and disappear the moment courage is free. That's not a coincidence. That's the entire definition of it. A person who checks in on you while the story is still live and unresolved is taking a real risk with their own social standing. A person who waits until the retraction is public to say something is taking no risk at all. You can hold both of those facts without turning it into a war. You just don't have to pretend the timing wasn't obvious. Number 6. Why you didn't post a single word in your own defense. People kept waiting for your statement. They wanted the emotional post, the tearful video, the long caption breaking down every false line one by one. You never gave it to them, and that absence became its own kind of story inside the story. People whispering that your silence must mean something, when really, it meant the opposite of what they assumed. Here's what silence actually was in that moment, and it's worth being specific about it, because just stay calm is easy advice and hard to explain. Every public statement you could have made in those 11 days would have been made without full information. You didn't yet know exactly what evidence existed, what could be proven, what the outlet's internal process looked like, or what your lawyer would eventually be able to demand. A statement made from anger and incomplete facts is a gift to the people who wrote the story, because it gives them something new to dissect, argue with, and use to paint you as defensive and emotional instead of simply correct. So instead of reacting to the story publicly, you responded to it privately, with precision. Every claim in that article got matched against something real, a date, a message, a location, a person who could confirm where you actually were and what actually happened. You weren't building a rebuttal for social media. You were building a record for the one audience that actually mattered, a legal team that could force a correction with consequences attached, instead of a comment section that would forget about it in a week, regardless of who was right. That's the version of strength nobody claps for in the moment, because it doesn't look like strength while it's happening. It looks like nothing. It looks like you not fighting back. But it was the only version of a response that could actually end this, instead of just extending it. Loud gets attention. Documented gets results. You pick the one that actually works. There's a version of this story where you post the statement everyone was waiting for, get a short burst of sympathy in the comments, and the article stays up forever anyway, unedited, uncorrected, permanently searchable, with your name attached to something false. That's what silence prevented. Not because silence has some mystical power, but because it bought the time the actual fix required. A statement satisfies an audience for a day. A retraction rewrites the record permanently. You picked the slower option because it was the only one that actually solved the problem instead of just soothing it. People will ask you, even now, why you never addressed it publicly yourself. The honest answer is that you did address it, just not to an audience of strangers scrolling for entertainment. You addressed it to the only audience whose opinion could actually change the outcome, an editor's legal counsel, reading a demand letter with your documented timeline attached to it. That audience doesn't care about your tone or your emotional delivery. It only cares about whether the claims hold up. Yours did, theirs didn't. Number 7, finding a lawyer who didn't need convincing. There's a particular relief in sitting across from someone whose job is not to comfort you, but to evaluate you, and having them tell you plainly that what happened to you has a name, a process, and a remedy. You didn't need someone to tell you the story was unfair. You needed someone to tell you whether it was actionable, and it was, almost immediately, because the story had the two things that turn a smear into a legal problem: false statements presented as fact, and damage that could be documented. The lawyer didn't ask you to prove you were a good person. That's not how this works, and it was almost strange how much lighter that made the whole thing feel. You didn't have to defend your character, you just had to show what was published, show that it was false, show what it cost you, and let the process do the rest. For the first time since the article dropped, the burden of proof wasn't sitting entirely on your shoulders in the court of public opinion. It had somewhere official to go. The first move wasn't a lawsuit. It rarely is, and that surprises people who expect this to look dramatic. The first move was a letter, a formal, specific, documented request for retraction, sent directly to the outlet and, critically, to their legal department, not just the editor who ran the piece. That letter did something the group chats and comment sections never could. It made this their legal problem instead of your public one. Somewhere, someone who thought this ended the day the article published got a phone call from their own legal team asking very direct questions about sourcing they suddenly couldn't produce. That's the moment this started tipping, not when people online started doubting the story. When the people who published it started doubting whether they could defend it. You didn't see that call happen. You didn't need to. You could feel the shift in how the story started being talked about within days. Less certainty, more hedging, people who'd shared it originally starting to add "allegedly" to captions that hadn't had it before. Lawyers move quietly, but they move things. Something changes in you too, the moment you're sitting across from someone who treats your situation as a solvable problem instead of a tragedy to be managed. You stop being the person the story happened to and start being the person building the response to it. That shift in posture matters more than people give it credit for. Panic keeps you a victim of the timeline. A plan puts you back in charge of it. Number 8. Building a file they couldn't argue with. This is the part that actually decided everything, and it happened almost entirely out of public view, which is exactly why it worked. While the story was still spreading, you and your legal team were assembling something far more boring and far more devastating than a public rebuttal: a timeline. Every claim in the article got isolated and checked against something concrete. The date they said a conversation happened, checked against your actual location that day, confirmed by something independent of your own word: a receipt, a message thread, a calendar entry that couldn't have been faked after the fact. The source close to the situation, they quoted anonymously, narrowed down, through process of elimination and a few careful questions, to someone whose account didn't hold up once asked to be specific. The quote attributed directly to you that you never said, traced back to nothing. No recording, no message, no verifiable moment where it could have been spoken. A true story survives this kind of scrutiny easily because it's built on things that actually happened and can be independently confirmed by more than one source. A fabricated story falls apart the moment someone stops asking, "Does this sound believable?" and starts asking, "Can this specific claim be proven?" That's the entire difference, and it's why they never expected anyone to actually check. They built this, assuming the worst thing that would happen is people arguing about it online for a week before moving on. They never planned for someone treating it like evidence, because evidence has to hold up to a standard that outrage never has to meet. Every hour you spent building that file was an hour they'd spent building something that couldn't survive being looked at closely. By the time the file was finished, it wasn't a defense anymore, it was a case. And a case doesn't ask people to believe you. It shows them exactly where the story breaks. In language a lawyer, an editor, and a courtroom would all recognize as the same thing: unverifiable, unsourced, false. Building that file was slow in a way that tested every bit of patience you had left. Some days, it was one phone call confirming one fact. Some days, It was waiting for someone to get back to you with a document you needed. None of it was satisfying the way posting something publicly would have been. But every single piece of it was permanent, in a way a viral response never is. A good comeback gets forgotten by next week. A verified timeline doesn't. You weren't building something for the algorithm. You were building something for the record. There's a discipline to this most people underestimate until they're forced into it. It would have been so much easier, so much faster, to simply say what you knew to be true and hope people believed you. But hoping isn't a strategy, and belief isn't proof. Every time you resisted the urge to explain yourself out loud and instead confirmed one more fact quietly, you were choosing a harder, slower path, precisely because it was the only one that actually led somewhere permanent instead of just somewhere loud. Number 9. The letter that landed on the wrong desk for them. There's a specific kind of letter that changes the temperature of a room the second it's opened, and a formal retraction demand from a lawyer is one of them. It doesn't arrive with threats. It doesn't need to. It arrives with specifics, the exact false statements, the exact damage they caused, the exact legal standard the outlet failed to meet before publishing, and a clear, dated request for correction with a deadline attached. Somewhere, an editor who signed off on running that story without full verification had to sit down and explain, in writing, why they ran it. Not to you, to their own legal counsel, whose entire job in that meeting was to protect the publication, not the reporter, not the source, not the people who paid for this in the first place. That's an important detail people miss. The moment a demand letter lands, the outlet's incentives change completely. They stop caring about defending the story and start caring about limiting their own exposure. That shift is what actually saves people in situations like this, more than public sympathy ever could. The outlet didn't retract the story because they suddenly felt bad. They retracted it because their own lawyers looked at the sourcing and told them, in no uncertain terms, that it wouldn't hold up if this went further, and that continuing to stand behind it was now more dangerous to them than admitting they'd gotten it wrong. Somewhere in that building, the writer who took the money to produce this was suddenly being asked to name sources they couldn't produce, confirm quotes they couldn't verify, and justify decisions they'd made, assuming no one credible would ever push back hard enough to matter. They assumed wrong. And the people who paid for the story in the first place, the ones who thought their names would never surface in any of this, were about to learn that a retraction doesn't just clear your name. Sometimes, depending on how it's worded, it starts pointing directly at where the story actually came from. Notice what changed the moment that letter arrived. Before it, the outlet had every incentive to defend the piece, because defending it protected their credibility and their relationship with the writer. After it, defending the piece became the more expensive option. That flip is the entire mechanism behind why retractions happen at all. It's not persuasion, it's cost. The letter didn't ask them to be kind. It made kindness cheaper than the alternative. This is also the point where the people who commissioned the story lost control of it completely, whether they realized it yet or not. Up until the letter, they were the ones steering, choosing the writer, shaping the angle, deciding the timing. The moment legal counsel got involved, the outlet stopped taking direction from them and started taking direction from its own lawyers, whose only loyalty was to the publication's exposure, not to the people who'd paid for the story in the first place. The people who started this no longer had a say in how it ended. Number 10. The newsroom that suddenly couldn't find its own sourcing. Every fabricated story is built on a foundation that only has to survive a casual reading. It's never built to survive a formal legal review, because nobody who commissions this kind of piece thinks it'll ever get that far. So when the letter forced an internal review, the cracks that existed from day one The ones you'd already mapped in your own file started showing up in their process too, and there was nowhere left to hide them. The anonymous source who supposedly confirmed the central claim turned out to be someone with an obvious, documented personal conflict, information that should have disqualified them as a credible source in the first place, if anyone had bothered to check before publishing instead of after. The direct quote attributed to you had no recording, no message, nothing beyond the writer's own notes, which suddenly, under scrutiny, looked less like documentation and more like a story someone decided to tell and then wrote down as if it had already been confirmed. This is the moment a newsroom either owns its mistake or digs in and makes it worse. To their limited credit, once their own legal team told them the story wouldn't survive a real challenge, they didn't dig in. They started drafting language for a correction, which meant admitting, in writing, on their own platform, that a story they'd published as fact didn't meet their own editorial standards. That process isn't fast, and it isn't supposed to be. Every word of a public retraction gets negotiated because it's essentially an admission with legal weight attached. Your lawyer didn't just want, "We regret any confusion." They wanted specific language. The claims were false. The sourcing didn't meet the outlet standards. The story should not have been published. That specificity is the entire point. A vague apology protects the outlet. A specific one protects you. 11 days after the story ran, they published it. Not buried, not quietly edited into the original piece with no acknowledgement. A clearly labeled, separately published correction, stating plainly that the original story was false. Every one of those 11 days had its own pressure. You were living your life, still showing up to work, still answering to people who'd read the story, while behind the scenes, a completely separate process was working through exactly the sequence it needed to work through. That gap between what you were visibly doing and what was actually happening is worth sitting with. From the outside, it looked like nothing was happening. From the inside, everything was. Think about what it must have felt like inside that newsroom, during those internal meetings, watching a story they'd been confident enough to publish slowly turn into a liability they couldn't defend. Nobody in that room was thinking about you as a person during those meetings. They were thinking about exposure, about precedent, about what happens to a masthead's credibility when a formal retraction goes out with their name on it. That's not sympathy, that's risk management. But risk management, in this case, happened to land exactly where the truth already was. Number 11, the retraction that ate its own headline. Read that again, because it's the whole video in one sentence. The same platform that ran the fake scandal was now forced to run a second story admitting the first one was false. That's not a small technical correction buried in an editor's note. That's a public reversal, time-stamped, dated, permanently attached to the original story for anyone who searches your name going forward. Think about what that actually does to the narrative that had been building for 11 days. Every person who shared the original headline now has a correction sitting right next to it. Every screenshot circulating without context now has a documented, published response proving it was false. The people who said no smoke without fire now have to explain why the fire department showed up and confirmed there was never a fire at all, just someone paying to make smoke. This is the part that separates a real vindication from a hollow one. A retraction isn't you saying you were wronged. It's the exact same institution that wronged you saying it, on the record, with legal review behind every word. That's not opinion. That's not sources say. That's the platform that published the lie, now being the platform that killed it, because they had no other option once the sourcing collapsed under review. People who spent 11 days confidently repeating a story now had to sit with the fact that their confidence had been borrowed from something false. Some of them will never say anything about it. Some of them will quietly stop bringing it up, hoping nobody remembers they were loud about it in the first place. And some of them, the ones who mattered least to you anyway, will try to minimize it, calling it just a correction, as if a formal public admission of fabrication is a small thing instead of exactly the outcome you spent 11 days working toward. It wasn't small. It was the entire point. You didn't need the world to feel sorry for you. You needed the record to say, permanently, that the story was false. Now it does. There's a particular kind of quiet that follows a retraction like this, different from the noisy quiet of the 11 days before it. This quiet is settled. Nobody's arguing about it anymore, because there's nothing left to argue. The document says what it says. The people who wanted ammunition against you no longer have any. That's not a small shift in tone. That's the entire fight ending, permanently, on paper. Number 12. The fallout landed on the people who built it, not you. Here's where this stops being about you clearing your name and starts being about what happens to people who build a fabricated story and get caught doing it. A public retraction doesn't just erase a headline, it creates a new question that didn't exist before. Who paid for this and why? The writer who took the assignment now has a retraction with their byline attached to it. Permanently searchable, the exact opposite of what any journalist wants tied to their name. Outlets talk. Editors remember who got them sued, who cost them credibility, who made them issue a public admission of failure. That's not a reputation that quietly disappears. That follows. And the people who commissioned this in the first place, the ones who sat in that original room and decided your name was worth the money, depending on how the demand letter and any following legal action was structured, their involvement doesn't necessarily stay hidden either. A retraction is often just the first domino. What comes after, discovery, follow-up questions, other people connecting the dots about who benefits from a story like this existing, tends to keep moving long after the correction itself is published. You didn't have to chase any of that. You didn't have to expose anyone personally, didn't have to name names in a public post, didn't have to turn this into a public campaign against the people who did it. You did the opposite of what they expected the entire time. You let the process do exactly what it's built to do, and the process doesn't care about optics or narratives. It cares about facts, sourcing, and consequences. Once those facts were established, the consequences moved on their own toward the people who actually built the lie. They spent money trying to make your life smaller. What they actually did was create a documented, public, permanent record proving they were willing to pay someone to lie about you. That record doesn't go away. Corrections stay attached to original articles indefinitely. This isn't following you anymore. It's following them. There's an irony worth naming plainly here. The entire plan depended on your name being the one attached to something damaging and permanent. Instead, it's their names, the writers, and whoever commissioned it, that are now attached to something damaging and permanent, in an industry where credibility is the only real currency anyone has. They spent resources trying to take something from you and ended up handing something to you instead. Proof, in writing, that you were telling the truth the entire time. Number 13. The people who came back once it was safe. Now come the messages. I always believed you. I knew it was fake from the start. I'm so glad the truth came out. From some of the same names that went quiet for 11 days, that didn't check in once, that let the story sit unchallenged in group chats they were part of. You don't have to explain to them why this feels different from support. You already know. Support that shows up after the outcome is already guaranteed isn't support. It's relief, dressed up to look like loyalty after the fact. So nobody has to admit they waited to see which way it would go before deciding what to say. This isn't about holding a grudge or keeping a scoreboard. It's about being honest with yourself about what you actually saw during those 11 days, because that information is real and it doesn't expire just because the story ended in your favor. The people who reached out before the retraction, before there was any certainty, before it was socially safe to defend you, those are the ones who told you something true about where you stand with them. Everyone else told you something true too. It's just a different truth. And pretending you didn't notice the timing does nobody any favors, least of all you. You don't need to confront anyone about it. You don't need a speech. You just quietly know now, with more clarity than you had before any of this happened, exactly who shows up when it costs something and who shows up once the cost is gone. That's not bitterness. That's information, and it's yours to use however you choose going forward. If a video like this reached you at exactly the right time, drop a 77 in the comments. Not for luck, just so it's clear this landed where it needed to. And if you want to help this channel keep making these, the super thanks button does exactly that. You get to decide, quietly and without drama, how much room these people get in your life going forward. Some of them will earn their way back in over time, through consistency instead of a single well-timed message. Some of them won't, and that's fine too. Neither decision needs to be announced. It just needs to be honest. It helps to separate two different groups here instead of lumping everyone together, because that's more accurate and more fair. There's the group that actively spread the story, added their own doubt to it, made it worse. And there's the group that simply didn't know what to do and defaulted to silence out of uncertainty rather than malice. Both left you standing alone during the hardest part, but they're not the same, and you don't owe either group the same response. Some of this is worth quiet forgiveness. Some of it isn't. You're allowed to tell the difference. Number 14. What the retraction actually proved beyond your name. It's easy to think the whole point of this was clearing your name, and it was, partly. But look at what actually got proven along the way, because it's bigger than one article. It proved that a fabricated story, no matter how convincingly it's written or how quickly it spreads, cannot survive contact with actual documentation. It proved that silence, used strategically instead of anxiously, isn't weakness. It's the only posture that lets you build a case instead of a reaction. It proved that the people willing to pay for a lie about you were never as careful, as protected, or as untouchable as they assumed they were while planning it. And it proved something about you specifically, something that mattered more than the headline ever did. You didn't need 11 days of public noise to know what was true. You already knew. What you needed was patience long enough to let the proof catch up to what you already understood about yourself, and you had exactly that patience, even when it would have been easier, faster, more emotionally satisfying in the moment to fight loud instead of fight smart. That's the actual skill here, and it's worth naming plainly instead of wrapping it in anything bigger than it is. Anyone can react. Very few people can wait, document, and let a process built for exactly this kind of situation do what it's designed to do. You did that. Under pressure, under public scrutiny, while people who claimed to know you were quietly stepping back, you stayed level enough to build something that actually worked, instead of something that just felt good to post at midnight. That's not luck. That's not the universe intervening on your behalf. That's a decision you made, repeatedly, for 11 straight days, to trust a slower process over a faster feeling, and it's the exact decision that ended this the way it did. It's worth saying plainly, this can happen again, to you or to someone else, in some other form. Reputations get attacked in a dozen different ways, and not every one of them will have this clean a resolution. But the method you used here, document instead of react, verify instead of assume, let a process built for exactly this situation do its job. That method holds regardless of the specific attack. That's the part worth keeping, long after this particular story stops mattering to anyone but you. There's also something worth saying to anyone watching this who's in the middle of their own version right now, still inside the 11 days, not yet at the retraction. The waiting is the hardest part, and nobody can promise you it resolves exactly this cleanly every time. But the instinct to slow down instead of speed up, to verify instead of vent, to find the person whose job is actually solving this instead of the platform that just lets you talk about it, that instinct is worth trusting, even when it feels like doing nothing. It was never nothing. It was the only thing that actually worked. Number 15. Where this leaves you now. The article is still searchable, and it always will be. That's the honest part nobody likes to say out loud. But right next to it, permanently, sits the retraction. Dated, specific, published by the same outlet, admitting in writing that the story was false. Anyone who looks now doesn't just find an accusation. They find the accusation and its correction, side by side. And the correction carries more weight than the original ever did, because it came from the same source that caused the damage. Forced to admit it under scrutiny, it couldn't survive. You know exactly who stood next to you during the 11 days when it wasn't guaranteed to end this way. You know exactly who waited to see which way the wind blew before deciding what to say. You know what it actually took to fix this, and it wasn't luck. And it wasn't a dramatic public confrontation. It was a file, a lawyer, a letter, a process that doesn't care about noise, only about what can be proven. They thought a fake headline would define you. Instead, it produced the most documented, most public, most undeniable proof of your credibility that you'll probably ever have. That's not something you asked for, but it's not nothing either. Somewhere down the line, someone new will come into your life, hear a fragment of this story secondhand, and ask you about it. You won't need to defend yourself in that conversation the way you would have needed to during those 11 days. You'll be able to point to something dated, specific, and public, published by the very people who tried to hurt you, admitting they were wrong. That's a strange kind of closure, not the loud, cinematic kind, but the quiet, permanent kind that just sits there, true, whenever anyone needs to check. If this one landed, drop a 77 in the comments so I know this reached the right person. And if you want to help keep this channel telling stories like this, the super thanks button does exactly that. Every bit of it goes back into this. You didn't need to prove anything to anyone. The retraction did that for you, in writing, permanently, from the people who tried to prove the opposite. That's the whole story. Not revenge, not luck, just the truth, finally forced into the open by people who had no other choice left. Thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next one. Take care and goodbye.